Well, hello and welcome to UChicago Networking Night, Alumni in Consulting, brought to you by Alumni Career Programs at UChicago Alumni. My name is Joshua Levitt. I'm a 2010 alumnus of the college and UChicago staff member. Through our alumni career programs, it's my pleasure and responsibility to help provide opportunities for lifelong learning, professional development, and community connection among fellow Maroons. Our Networking Night series brings together alumni within and across industries as we learn more about each other's journeys into multifaceted fields. This evening, you'll hear from 3 alumni from different academic tracks within the university who have developed their expertise in various areas of consulting. I'm delighted to introduce Chuck Brooks, named among the top tech people to follow on LinkedIn as a leading voice on cybersecurity, Daphne Yin, head of sustainability and climate for Indu4 North America, and Andrew Schur from Boston Consulting Group's Plantinian. Following our conversation, we'll network with one another, that is, consult each other on career advancement in consulting. We'll record this part of our session, and then I'll turn off the recording for networking chats. But please feel free to be on camera or off camera for this part as you prefer. Of course, don't hesitate to drop questions in the chat. Ever dependable for meaningful discourse. Some of you UChicago alumni have sent me questions in advance, so we'll try to cover as many as possible. Let me highlight our guest speakers, our featured panelists. We have Chuck Brooks, we have Daphne Yin, and we have Andrew. Where'd you go? You left my screen, Andrew.
I'm right here, if that helps.
There you go. That does. Wonderful. All right. There's all this Zoom choreography that we're still mastering. Okay, excellent. There we go. So I thought one way to begin our panel conversation is UChicago style with a definition. So people who borrow your watch and tell you what time it is and then walk off with the watch. That's how the late Avis CEO Robert Townsend infamously described consultants. So I wanted to ask the 3 of you, how do you define consultants? Or maybe another way to put it is, like, how does your work enact certain definitions or counter definitions of consultants? I know this was something that we were just talking about before we started. We have certain reference points, not only that cynical definition, but also popular depictions like George Clooney in Up in the Air. So Chuck, why don't we start with you? How do you define consultants, or how does your work maybe play into or work against certain preconceptions of what a consultant is?
Well, I think, since I'm the oldest on the panel here, I think it's really evolved in its meaning and interpretation. Consultants early on were almost primarily from firms, either Booz Allen or Boston, McKinsey, and all that, and they're still out. They're still thriving, particularly in Washington, where they take their expertise usually to the clients' offices or do whatever they need to do. I spent some time as an embedded consultant for McKinsey, so I got that flair. But my perception of consultancy is a little bit different. I think it more towards the gig economy now. I think it's when you bring your own expertise and capabilities to a niche where there's a need, where maybe the companies just don't have that capability, or they can't afford it, or they need you for a special project, and then you take that expertise and you market it, and you be entrepreneurial and you consult. You bring your expertise into the business or the agency, wherever you're going.
Interesting. Yeah, I like how you say it really. On the one hand, a shift in the model, but not necessarily in the purpose or function.
Well, I think the other model still exists. It's still thriving. I think that the difference is that now, particularly after remote work and COVID and all that, a lot of people found out they could do a lot of the stuff they were doing at home. And I'm an example of that. I was actually working full time with General Dynamics Mission Systems as a growth strategist for cybersecurity. And when it hit, there's no more office. And all of a sudden you have, a lot of people you're dealing with saying, can you help me on this? And said, yeah. So it sort of evolved naturally. And so that kind of consultancy and it's a different kind of challenge. It brings two different things. When you're working for a company itself, it's really more like a law firm, or your hours and what you're doing. But when you're working for a consultancy for yourself, you have to have a different set of parameters. Obviously, time management is one of the biggest ones. And also, your fees, everything is different in what you're going to do, what you want to do.
Interesting. Yeah, Daphne, what do you think? How do you define consultant, either in theory or in your practice?
Yeah, I think Chuck kind of comes with this more independent consulting perspective. I work for a very small boutique consulting firm, and I think Andrew's, working on the bigger side. So it's actually good to have that spectrum here. As Chuck said, consulting in and of itself is like a pretty broad term. Like I would almost contrast it to a staff person in an organization, right? It's really somebody who is providing third-party expertise to an organization that may not have that in-house capacity. And so in and of itself, it's not a dirty word, but it has some of these dirty associations, because I think there has been, unfortunately, a trend for some consultants to kind of come in and basically repackage what an organization already knows, or to parachute in with a lot of different projections. And I do want to kind of acknowledge the half truth there. Like there is consulting that is done poorly in that way. Early in my career, I do remember having a couple of projects I was staffed on where the client was a large development finance institution, and they had like a very kind of indulgent view of a very sophisticated analysis that they wanted done to look at basically climate change adaptation in the tea and coffee sectors. And I think the farmers on the ground actually knew what had to happen. But because the DFI wanted to bring in a consultant to look at this issue, I think we wasted quite a lot of time using kind of fancy techniques to get at basically like conclusions around sustainable practices that, again, the farmers and small businesses already knew needed to be done. So that's an example of where I think consulting can kind of fall prey to this, like, telling the time with the watch and walking away with that.
Right.
And I think it's really important ethically for consultants to be able to negotiate with clients for a more real, like, respectful and appropriate scope whenever that actually is a risk.
Interesting. So I guess to build off of that example, what might that look like?
So something that's very common in consulting is that you'll receive what's called a request for proposals from clients. And I think a lot of consultants just kind of react passively and say, okay, I'm going to do this for this price. In some cases, when you have more trust built with the client, you actually have the ability to push back and proactively help co-define what the scope of work is or what a good budget would look like. So I think that's where you have a little bit more cushion to define what would be a meaningful project.
Yeah, it's that co-definitional that work. I like that concept. I think that really helps kind of draw that distinction, say, between consulting that is done poorly or is done in that cynical way, and consulting that's done in a more meaningful, productive way. Thank you. I think that really I think that helps. Andrew, you're up. What's your vision of the consultants? Are you that vision?
I think I'd like to embody it, but I do agree with what Daphne and Chuck have said so far about the technical expertise, or just miscellaneous industrial expertise approach. Because that was my previous life. I was at a boutique for 4 years before I joined BCG. And so the definition I kind of want to get at is what I think Robert Townsend was getting at: the people who borrow your watch and tell you what time it is and then walk off with the watch. So I think I do now work for that kind of firm that tells you really obvious things and then charges you exorbitant amounts of money for it. but I think that's more about, it kind of sounds weird now that I said that out loud, but it's more that maybe someone within the org wanted to push an agenda, or maybe there's a conflict, which really was my last project, between two different organizations that they couldn't resolve and really just needed a mediator, and that's what we were. So it definitely was a lot of repeating very obvious things, but like back to kind of what Chuck and Daphne were talking about, that's just part of what I do. The other part of what I do is that level of technical expertise, which really ties to the true definition of what I think a consultant is. Because I think consultants, they're not just people who work for consulting firms, right? Like if you talk to a lawyer, I think they're a law consultant. If you talk to a doctor, I think they're a health consultant, like a dietitian or something, someone, they help you, they consult, you know? So it's pretty broad, but I've only lived about 2 or 3 definitions of what a consultant is.
Yeah, I like that. That perhaps consultant, in as much as it is a profession unto itself, it's also one really defined by its like function. Is that fair to say, or by its like purpose?
I like function because a lot of,
yeah,
because
like
sometimes
function.
there's also I think a popular staffing model is staff augmentation, where consulting firms will just put their people into companies as if they were the client's employees in the first place.
Right.
A function is good.
Interesting. All right. So then why did you choose to pursue a career in consulting, following your education at the University of Chicago, and have these reasons changed over time? Andrew, we'll start with you again, keep you in the hot seat.
I think I was influenced by my mom because she wanted me to, of course, go into finance or something fancy. And I think after my actual path started in SAP. It was the summer of my second year. I started at Volkswagen. I was just a financial controller. So that's where I got my first taste of SAP. And then that's after my third year summer, I interned for this boutique called Truqua. And that's when I became an SAP consultant. And then I realized the world of SAP is actually ridiculously big. And then, yeah, after college, I joined Truqua for 4 years before we were bought out by IBM. And then I really wanted to take a shift with my career where I kind of didn't want to do SAP anymore and wanted to do a lot more general technology. So I moved over to BCG. Also, I like to travel. I really don't like the idea of a desk job, but now I travel to other places and do work at a desk. So it's really a desk job, but I move around a lot. So that's also fun.
Yeah, I like that. And that you say, all right, you kind of start off with of course, an intellectual interest, but also, those personal motivations. And then as you get your feet wet and so on, it also becomes about work style or what you prefer to do. And that, appreciate that. How about Daphne? We'll work our way backwards, reverse order.
I don't think I see my career as consulting focused. I see it really as a means to work with a diverse set of organizations that are navigating environmental and social challenges. So at some point, I think I will probably move to be a practitioner working in an organization more long-term. I think in college, we were still very nascent in terms of exploring environmental studies, like that curriculum had just begun when I was a student. Sure. And management consulting was really bounded around the big 3 firms like McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. So I wasn't really aware, honestly, of working in sustainability consulting until much later. Initially in college, I was really interested in urban planning, actually, and had a couple of internships in Chicago, New York, at planning agencies / economic development agencies. Could not find a job upon graduation in that field. And so I worked in real estate for a while as like a financial analyst, which is very kind of procedural, repetitive work. And in my head, I was like, I have to get out of this. I have to make a huge career pivot. And so I started being a research assistant for Richard Sander, who is kind of the father of carbon markets. And so that was my entryway into working on climate, which then became climate and forests, and it's now like more kind of like climate and forestry and land use. So I think I ended up pivoting into consulting really as one avenue to work on these issues of climate and forest, but it was more my passion for the issue area or the sector as opposed to let's do consulting.
Right. Yeah, I see that as more like content, not like content driven, but perhaps in a way, right? It's like the nature of the work and what you're doing, and consulting is a means to that. I also really appreciate what you said about pivoting, because I know that many of our Maroons who are tuning in are have expressed to me that they are considering a pivot into consulting or within consulting. So I really appreciate that note as well. Thank you, Daphne. Chuck, lay it on us. Why did you choose to pursue a career in consulting? Or in
I think the career pursued me, but I think Washington D.C. is more of it's a consulting world here, and it always has been. A lot of it, of course, is political and government relations, but you can't walk down the street with meeting 5 consultants that are working for something, trying to get a policy position pushed or wherever. And I was first confronted with those kind of people. I took a job with the late Senator Alan Specter. This is also pretty interesting about the perspective of the University of Chicago degree. And he was a bit of an elitist. He went to Yale Law School and taught at Penn. And he would not have anyone on his staff that didn't have a top university. So he said, where'd you go to school? And I said, University of Chicago. Okay, let's hear more then. And so the University of Chicago thing meant something, and it meant a lot in other positions here too in Washington, by the way. It has a really good reputation. But what happens is you get thrown into this role as a senior staffer for a senator, and all of a sudden you're given a group of issues. My issues was primarily focused on foreign affairs and international relations and security, but I got all these other things added to technology and all this. And so you have to develop your own expertise, and you have to go out and meet the right people that know this. And it's constant learning, because you have to basically represent the senator or the policies throughout that. So that's when I really became ingrained in the consulting type of work, even though I was doing it for Congress. And then I think the real pinnacle where I really decided that, I really want to move this way was when I worked at the Department of Homeland Security. I was one of the first people there. I was considered a plank holder, they call it. And they asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, I want to help set up the legislative affairs shop, and also want to work with the new Directorate of Science and Technology. And in that world too, I was confronted, not even confronted, printed a bad word, but given all these new opportunities to work with labs around the world that are working in things like counterterrorism, cybersecurity, biological research, et cetera, just anything to do with any kind of security area. And so you develop an expertise, or at least you know who to go to. And then I figured out, one of the things about consultants is not that you have to know it all yourself. You can also know who to go to. And that's where I learned that there. I had a path afterwards that took me, to industry, where I worked in executive roles. But on the way there, I always worked a bit on the side as a consultant. I always had something outside that wasn't conflicting, usually with a foreign country or something that, was totally outside of what my work realm was. But so it did find me in that sense. So I just think it's, DC is a different kind of place, granted, but I think the model of DC now is a model that's going to a lot of other big cities. And, with consulting, so it's really is you really are picking a passion and developing your expertise, and you're deciding what you want to do in that workflow. And this again, is from more of an independent consultant perspective, but you could also align with a firm with your expertise too, depending what it is. But so I think that's where it sort of evolved, and now I have no intention of ever going back to a full-time firm because of that, because you pick your interests, and it is more fulfilling.
Yeah, I appreciate that. In fact, it's inspired me to take at least one of our Q&A questions now for the panel. How does consulting as a field fit in with the UChicago slogan? That's all well and good in theory. Sorry, that's all well and good in practice, but how does it work in theory? That is, advice may sound good or reasonable or clever, whether or not it actually helps. I love that phrase, slogan of my first house on campus, Breckenridge. So that's all well and good in practice, but how does it work in theory? Do you think that UChicago phrase dovetails with consulting or vice versa?
I personally do, because I think University of Chicago's got a tradition of independent thinking, academic rigor, and those are the kind of things you need for the consulting. You really need to be able to look at an issue or a topic and understand the intricacies. And Chicago does that in its approach for everything they've done, since the university was created. So, and I think it's even more so in terms of reputation here in Washington. There's a lot of Ivy League schools, and they're good schools and stuff, but a lot of them are a little bit different. When you mention Chicago, they think academics, they think seriousness. And I think that seriousness brings a lot of credibility to consultancy. So I think the University of Chicago flag is a good one to wave.
Nice, I appreciate that. Daphne, do you think like your work is about how do practice and theory come together or push against one another in climate and sustainability work?
Yeah, I think one thing to really note about consulting is your budgets are very limiting, and so you're not going to be able to do justice to a topic that you might have for a dissertation as your PhD. You might be asked by a client to work on that over the course of a couple of months, right? And so I think there is a lot of shortcutting that happens, especially in terms of clients' expectations. And given our training at UChicago, I think it is really worthwhile to have a serious conversation about what caveats you need to include with your work. I also work with a lot of donors who are, they're supporting what seems to be really wonderful work in the climate and land use sphere. But when you look at their theories of change in terms of what kind of activities might support certain outcomes and impacts, often there isn't a really kind of rigorous approach to determining whether that intervention is worth funding. And this is actually a really ripe debate right now, because in some ways, if you take a rights-based approach, there is this kind of trust-based philanthropy movement that's emerged with Mackenzie Scott, where she is saying, I'm going to give money to groups who actually know what they would like to do with this, even without requesting this huge evidence base. So it's a live debate in terms of how much rigor you really need to bring to some of this work, as opposed to trust that people are actually working in the right direction. Again, this is more on climate change and sustainability. But I am typically, like, on my team, the person who is really pushing the most on the rigor. And even then we have to make compromises, again, because the budgets are just smaller.
Interesting. Yeah. So that really kind of forces that hand, the theory practice hand right there. Appreciate that. All right, Andrew, what do you think? Theory and practice?
I actually, I got asked this by a client, and I don't think he knew I went to UChicago. He straight up asked me if I understood the difference between theory and practice, and I thought he was making fun of me. But it turns out he was making fun of the other contractor, so I saved my butt there. And it was very surprising. It completely caught me off guard. But in my opinion, I mean, now I'm in management consulting. It's definitely a lot more theory. Because I used to be an implementations consultant, and that was definitely less theory and more practical. So just being able to say no to certain client requests because the software physically cannot do that. But now since it's more, I do a lot more management consulting. It's a lot more on the theory side. So for example, how do we, in Chuck's realm, right? How do we help set up a multi-cloud strategy in this other country or in Europe compared to the US, right? There are certain things we have to tie to, like very specific data regulations, but there are also theoretical parts on how they can approach their own cloud strategy, how they want to build their team, how they want to set it up, when they want to set it up, and just a lot of other questions to answer. So a good mix of both.
I like that. That's so funny that that like actually came up.
Yeah, it
That
scared me. I
that
thought he stalked me on LinkedIn.
right. Oh man. So all right. Well, so then I guess let me ask you. We'll dive in. Of course, within the parameters of non-disclosures and all those sorts of agreements. What has been the most energizing or enervating problem you've had to solve? So let's see. How about let's start with we'll start with Daphne this time. Most energizing or enervating problem you've had to solve?
Yeah. Um, Before I dive into the details, I think this gets back to, the negotiation with the client about what is a like what's a good approach. So I've been working with a client for the past 5 years in China. And as you probably all know, China is going through a really difficult time politically right now in terms of limits on free speech, limited transparency. And I think one of the most challenging things that I'm going through right now is how to essentially tell the client, I can't do this work anymore, that they need to increase their standards around basically assuring that human rights are being respected.
Mm,
And it's a pretty tricky conversation because there is that power dynamic with the client. And I wrote like a very long memo kind of explaining how it's really difficult to ensure that environmental and social standards are being followed in these very large scale forestry programs. So they range from desertification control programs in Inner Mongolia to large scale reforestation, afforestation programs in subtropical parts of the country. And across 11 or so provinces that I've been working in, what's just become really clear is that the kind of scope of work that the client has me working on, which is to provide due diligence, monitoring, and technical assistance, it's not enough to ensure that the work is truly delivering the kind of climate and environmental and social benefits that they would like it to. So
right,
there's
so
a, yeah, it's really tricky because on one hand, like this work is truly meaningful. It's really inherently complex and decentralized, just working in China. But yeah, kind of trying to stay together with the client in terms of a more of a peer relationship and discussing how to navigate the political environment in China.
yeah, I appreciate that response because it sounded like it was both not only the say like the challenge itself, but also the dynamics at play even in discussing that challenge and what your proposals were, like how that's another level, right, of an energizing or enervating challenge in this field. It could be like the topic of the conversation or the conversation itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So I
and I'll
really
just
appreciate.
add quickly that, sometimes the client is, really kind of state of the art in their thinking, and other times they are not necessarily up to speed on what best practice looks like. And they're beholden
Right.
to stakeholders, and those stakeholders are also expecting that you will push the client. So it's really important to take a more holistic view when you're doing this work, as opposed to just restricting yourself to the client kind of consultant relationship.
Right. Yeah, thank you. I think that helps like even round that out even further. Chuck, cybersecurity is top of mind. What has been the most energizing or enervating problem you've had to solve?
Gosh, there's been a lot of them, but I put it in a generic sense. I think the biggest problem I have mostly with clients is their misunderstanding of how the US government works. A lot of them want to get contracts with Department of Defense or DHS or other agencies, and they think they could go in and just submit their product or their service, and it's an easy, they may be the best and breed, whatever, but it doesn't work that way. And they find out really quickly that there's all kinds of regulatory issues, there's all kinds of processes, there's clearance requirements, there's cultural issues too between the different agencies, and there's relationship issues that you need to do in timing, or when you can actually meet with the people who are making the authority to fund these projects. So I think that's generically the biggest problem I have with clients, particularly from the ones from overseas, we understand how our system works, and why you need to do this, and why you need to have the right accounting, why you need to particularly maybe affiliate with a U.S. organization if you want to do business. But in cybersecurity, it is, there's always a problem because people are panicking. They've just been breached, or they have an insider issue. They don't know what to do. They don't know where to get help. So it's always an issue for me to lead them to the right people and get the right people involved, because I tell them that it's more than a C-suite issue. You really have to have your marketing, sales, your public relations people, your legal people involved when you get to a cybersecurity issue, because it impacts on the reputation as well as the operational capabilities of the company or industry you're in. So those are always challenges. I mean, they're never easy. They're always challenges, and that's why they need consultants, because it can't do it alone.
Yeah, especially, I mean, in a field where things can change so rapidly.
Just artificial intelligence being introduced now with, in cybersecurity alone has changed the whole landscape, and particularly with the adversaries using it to send phishing attacks and discover vulnerabilities. And so it's a different world out there. It's a digital world, and people are not typically ingrained in that world. They're operating from the past and the brick and mortar perspective, and they don't realize that the whole paradigm has changed. So it's a process of educating them too, as well as doing what they want you to do for them, but also educating them.
I say that, yeah, that's essentially the educational component as well. So aside from unexpected interview questions, Andrew, what's been the most energizing or innovating challenge?
Hey, can I break in? Can I break in? This is Julie. Do I get a chance? This is Julie.
Of course. We're about to open the floor to audience Q&A.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought
That's no problem,
the entire
Julie.
group. So sorry. I thought this was the entire group. I did not know that this was a panel. Never mind. Sorry.
No, we're just starting off, and you're eager. You're ready. I can feel it. We're all ready.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and it's gonna close us off, and then we're gonna open the floor, Julie.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks. Sorry, Julie. I promise we'll get to you. I think I've been lucky enough to work on some very, very cool projects with very big, small, whatever companies. But I think the two most recent, and purely by chance, I ended up on two federal projects back to back. The first was the naval shipyards, and the second was the F-35 fighter jet. And it's interesting because Navy was my first federal project, and here I am thinking, oh, I don't want to work for the government. The speed of the government, the bureaucracy, etc. It's going to be super slow and boring. Parts of it were, yes, actually super slow and kind of boring, but I think it was a sheer scale, and I think just the level of impact that these projects could have that was really fascinating. For example, at the Navy shipyards, I was on a team that developed a digital transformation strategy to pretty much overhaul all the shipyards technology over the next 20 years. This is public information. There is a program right now called SIOP, Shipyards Infrastructure Optimization Program. It's a humongous program, and if you work in government, you've probably heard about it. It's $20 billion over 20 years, effectively, and they just want to modernize Navy shipyard technology. But they didn't consider every single piece of digital infrastructure that has to go into it, which was what my team and I did. And then the next one, of course, was working on the F-35 project. Yes, it's a very controversial jet, but it's cool. It's a fighter plane. Like, I've always wanted to work in aerospace. I had a lot of like fighter jet toys growing up. So being able to work on the F-35 project, it was just great. The people I got to meet, the people I got to work with, all the places we traveled around to look at F-35s and actually help resolve a lot of their problems was just fascinating. I'm sorry, I can't go into more detail beyond that.
we totally understand, but that does sound quite fascinating and definitely complex and high stakes.
I also learned something very fun about government work, and I think this is a life pro tip for anyone who wants to do government work. If you just if you mention mission, everyone will go on your side. You say this is mission critical, and everyone will say, "Oh my gosh, this guy's right. You got to follow the mission." Like,
pro tip.
yeah.
Awesome. All right, let's no, Julie, it's fine. It's great. As I said, you're eager. We're going to open up the floor to to attendee Q&A. We'll bring down. So go ahead, Julie. Why don't you start us off? And then a few questions came in.
I really don't have any questions for the panel. Sorry, guys. No,
comments.
I literally thought this was a group go around the room type of a thing. I'm also multitasking on multiple things like walking the dog, picking up dog poop, all kinds of stuff.
Sure.
So I've missed the boat. I missed the boat.
Oh, no problem. We are also going to do that part.
I mean, the only comment I have is I do really super boutique finance and accounting consulting. I've got the Booth degree. I've got a CPA and accounting from Illinois. But I was at a firm before I became a Truon in this consulting firm. I was at CNA Financial with the cybersecurity attack, probably the largest cybersecurity attack that's ever occurred. March 21, 2021. Yeah, and 11 days before our Q end. And we had no access to anything, zero. I was an employee there. And I count that as the top 3. And my career's pretty lengthy. The top 3 things you don't want to miss being at a firm for. So it was so interesting how we had to figure it out. Old school way. Really. Yeah. So I just wanted to comment on that. It was, anybody can look up the CNA Financial cybersecurity attack, but it was one employee that brought down the whole firm. One employee.
But yeah, I hear that, right? And it's just interesting both in the ways that those sorts of like the nature of the problems and the extent of damage can shift, as well as like the tools with which we like address those problems and so on, evolve over time as well. So yeah, I appreciate that.
There's very little tools that can be made ahead of time to try and address something like that. It's in the moment, you make it up as you go along. I mean, just simple things like, when you think of when you're working in a business, everything is either on the SharePoint site or it's where do you store your stuff? You don't store it at home. You don't store it in your Gmail account. Everything is with work, including cell phone number trees. So we had to reach out to counterparts on LinkedIn. Hey, what's your cell phone number so I can call you? It was.
I do what you gotta do. You gotta be resourceful.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. But I don't really have any other comments. It's just been interesting to listen to. Thanks so much. Okay.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. Some other questions that have come in for Chuck, Daphne, and Andrew. One is just any tips on breaking into the field, or like making a name for yourself, staking a claim, whatever metaphor you want to use, because sometimes it can be difficult to get business until you have a reputation, but then you can't get a reputation without the clients. So like how do you manage that paradox there in the consulting field?
Well, I think you have to be an advocate for yourself if you're consulting, and one of the ways to be an advocate is to publish. There's plenty of now avenues you can do that on, including your LinkedIn. LinkedIn networking is also, I think, essential. So you're sharing your profile and your interests with potential clients as well as potential people you might work for. So those two things are really good. And then I also, speaking at events, conferences, certainly is a good way to market yourself. Also develop a reputation and people follow you. So I think I think it's a process. You start from, just a few, you build it up and you continue to do so. And particularly in your area of expertise, the more you research and write about it, the more you become an expert. So it's a good model. I teach at Georgetown cybersecurity risk management, and I insist my students publish something on their LinkedIn or do something related to what they want to do in their career, because I think at least it gives them now the things have changed from the traditional resumes, to saying, okay, where's your knowledge base? What do you know? Where are you going? Can you write? And that's the other thing that a lot of places find that people cannot write. So if you can write, you've got a head start.
I see this. So it's both like perhaps honing that skill for yourself as practice, but it's also like a sort of content marketing for yourself to or a skills-based, to show, sorry, a skills-based marketing, so they show that you can do that work that will be valuable already. Absolutely.
I mean, you learn, particularly with technology, it's changing so fast, and there's so many aspects to it, from policy, to the actual functioning. If you're looking from a science background, so there's a lot of different avenues you can take, and a lot of topics you can write about. The only advice I give people is try and stay away from politics if they can, if they're going to be in the public viewpoint, because you're going to alienate 50% of the people half the time. So it's better to avoid all those kind of things to write about.
I suppose, would the exception be if you want to be a political consultant?
That would be the exception.
Right. Let's open for Daphne, Andrew. What do you think about breaking in?
Yeah, I think this connects really well with Connie's question, actually, about should young people go into consulting?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I think it really depends. I think in college, a lot of people are won over by the kind of reliability of a consulting or an iBanking gig, and they don't really necessarily know what's drawing them to consulting, actually, but it seems very kind of safe and secure, and also intellectually challenging. I also think that, because these larger firms have the resources to recruit on campus, they are very attractive, sometimes predatory, but they also have the resources to provide these rotational programs and provide exposure across a lot of different clients. So I think it's okay for people to start out in consulting, but often what happens is there's burnout, and you do want to make sure that you're working for a good consulting firm. And I think to be consulting in your later parts of your career, kind of like what Chuck is saying, you do need to establish expertise in the field and in a specialization. I don't think that we need more generalists, to be honest. Right now, we need specialists who have a holistic view and see the interconnections, but they need to have really deep sectoral expertise. And so I think for those of you on the call who are already working in a particular sector, make sure to always just kind of build your network within the field. Don't stay too closeted in the company, because once you leave, you want to have potential clients to go to or potential collaborators. So I would really encourage just building your practitioner experience in the field as opposed to within one company. In the sustainability sector, things are moving so fast. And I would say if you're breaking out into the sustainability field right now, there's so much work that's needed in the energy transition. And then the area I work on, forest and agriculture, the world is really burning. So we would also love new entrants into this space. But for these kind of gigs, I think it really helps to work for other organizations actually before you enter consulting, so that you're building up that initial base of expertise first.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up Connie's question. And Connie, fellow 2010 classmate, excellent question about the views on how young people should go into consulting. Andrew, do you agree? Right, you went straight in into the field from a college.
Yeah, it's I think after I joined BCG, I realized that what I was doing for the first 4 years out of college wasn't really consulting in most regards. I was just kind of a doer in a lot of instances. I was, told we have to implement this system. We have to put in, it was literally going through SAP and entering these master data codes, these company codes, I wouldn't really call that consulting. That's kind of more like doing. And so when I have a joke later I'll tell in the breakout rooms, but it's when I moved over to the BTG, I do definitely completely agree with Chuck and Daphne here, and also tying to Connie's question. Consultants are people who have expertise, but in order to break in, I think you have to convey the fact that you, as the expert, are able to convey that you are an expert, and it does add value to your clients. And that can either be through publications, conferences, or just having strong social skills. Social skills like speaking, etc., being able to just convey what exactly you're talking about. So if someone's just an expert and they kind of just keep to themselves, that's kind of like what I did on my old job. I just implemented SAP the whole time. And then that's kind of like what my opinion of people who start at, say, for instance, BCG, McKinsey, Bain, right out of college. I think the people that move to these kinds of firms after doing other things will stay a lot longer. Because when I look at what associates at BCG do, honestly, 95% of their job is making slides, and 5% of their job is actually consulting or bringing up an idea. And of course, a lot of them are going to burn out because the job sucks. Like, not gonna lie, it kind of sucks.
One PowerPoint can change the world, Andrew.
Yeah, but if you're just doing what other people tell you to do, and 5% of your job is actually speaking up and expressing your opinion, your insight, then that's kind of different. I would say for myself, I built expertise first out of college, and then I moved over to what I think is true consulting. So I guess that's my perspective on it.
Can I just add really quickly? I think joining a firm where they actually give you real responsibility is so important, so that you're not just making slides, you're actually able to get real exposure to clients. Client-facing experience is really critical, like being able to manage a project, in addition to doing the actual kind of implementation of the work, is really critical. And some large consulting firms are good at doing that, but I would actually really encourage looking at the boutique consulting firms where people are spread thin and they will delegate lots of really cool work to you. Otherwise, you're just the bottom, tier, and people are going to delegate all the things they don't want to do to you.
Yeah, that's how I started out at a boutique, and then we got bought out by IBM. So yeah.
Yeah, can I make a comment to what Andrew and Daphne and everybody was saying? Essentially, when you are fresh into consulting after college, be prepared to be a grinder. So we have the jokes at the one of those big fours where I spent a few years. We call that, okay, you have the actually grinders, miners, and the deal makers, right? And then what we said is, the worst get fired, the best leaves, the worst get fired, the mediocre make partners. That's the inside joke at one of the big fours, right? So essentially, if you are new, fresh out of college, just like what Andrew said, you're not really doing consulting. You're basically doing the grinders work, right? But make sure you actually seek opportunity from people who do have client relationships. Make sure you get exposure early on, because in consulting, everything is a sale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you so much for weighing in. Well, I think what we'll do, I want to make sure that you have enough time to have some breakout sessions where you can continue to ask these sorts of questions. I see in the chat we have very spirited debate on the specialist versus generalist concepts. And then also, I just want to call out a few comments that have come in, really generating just some very interesting insights about, for instance, the nature of consulting as involving working across fields of knowledge daily, taking complex and difficult situations, creating fast solutions, or relatively fast solutions that are clear to clients. And then, and then also the fact that, sometimes even consultants need some consulting and coaching in terms of what skills to beef up. So I want to be able to make sure that we have time for everyone to explore those with each one. What we'll do is you'll see different breakout rooms, one specific to Andrew's field, one to Daphne's, one to Chuck's. We'll have a general what even is consulting breakout room, and just a general networking room as well, so that you can continue to build that roster of Maroon connections. So I'll make sure that we have time for that. Then we'll regroup. I want to highlight a couple of upcoming events and resources for our UChicago alumni community in career advancement. So let's open up the floor. Thank you so much, and let's get to it. All right, let me